The advertisement was only 11 words long. Widower. 7 children. Needs a wife who can cook. Dust Creek. It ran in 3 newspapers across 2 territories, and every woman who read it either laughed or shook her head and turned the page. 7 children. A widower. In Dust Creek, a town so forgotten by civilization that the last preacher who passed through reportedly wept when he saw it, and kept writing. But one woman didn't laugh. She read those 11 words at a train station in Missouri, standing in the cold with a carpetbag in one hand and a letter she just finished burning in the other. The ashes floated up like black moths and disappeared into the February sky. She watched them go without blinking. Her name was Clara Beale. 31 years old. No children of her own. No family left to speak of. She had a face that men noticed and a silence about her that made those same men uneasy. She could cook, that part was true. She could also do things no mail-order advertisement would ever think to mention. She tucked the clipping into her coat pocket, bought a ticket west, and didn't look back at Missouri once. What she was running from, no one in Dust Creek would know, not at first. And what she carried in that carpetbag wasn't just pots and spice jars and a spare dress. It was something that would either save that broken family of 8, or bring the deadliest men in the territory straight to their door. She boarded the train at dusk. By the time she arrived in Dust Creek 9 days later, 2 men were already following her. What would you have done, if you were her? The town of Dust Creek did not greet visitors so much as tolerate them. It sat in a wide, flat basin between 2 red ridges like something the desert had tried to swallow, and then spat back out, half digested. The buildings were weathered silver gray, warped by heat and neglect. The main street was 40 yards of packed dirt that the wind swept clean every morning and filled back in with grit every afternoon. There was a general store, a saloon called the Buckhorn that smelled like regret and bad whiskey, a livery stable, a jailhouse with a permanently crooked door, and a church that held services only when Reverend Calloway came down from Harmon's Bluff, which was 3 times a year if the weather held. That was Dust Creek. Population, 61 souls, give or take, depending on the week. Eli Cutter lived 2 miles outside of town on a homestead that had once been his father's and his grandfather's before that. The land was hard and dry and demanded everything a man had every single season, and sometimes gave back just enough to make leaving feel impossible. The house was a wide planked adobe structure with a covered porch, and 4 rooms inside and a 5th that had been added crooked when the 5th child arrived and nobody had time to measure properly. Eli himself was 42, though most people guessed 50 when they first saw him. He wasn't a big man, average in height, lean in the way that men get when they work too hard and eat too little, but there was something in the way he stood that made people give him room. Like a fence post driven deep into bedrock. His hands were scarred from work. His eyes were the color of creek water in autumn, gray-brown and still. He wore his grief the way a man wears old boots, so long he'd stopped noticing the weight of them. His wife, Mary, had died 2 winters ago. Fever. It had come fast and left him with 7 children and a household that ran like a wagon with 1 wheel, veering and lurching and somehow still moving forward. The oldest was Thomas, 16, who'd stopped being a boy the morning they buried his mother. Then came Ruth, 14, who'd taken over the cooking and cleaning with a grim efficiency that broke Eli's heart every time he watched her. Then Joseph, 12. The twins, Alice and May, 9. Then Henry, 6. And last was little Samuel, 3 years old, who still sometimes wandered into the main room at night calling for someone who wasn't there anymore. Eli had placed the advertisement without ceremony. He sat at the kitchen table one evening after all the children were asleep, wrote the 11 words on a scrap of paper, and handed it to the postal rider the next morning without discussing it with anyone. Ruth found out 3 weeks later when a woman wrote back. Eli showed her the letter. Ruth read it once, set it on the table, and went back to kneading bread dough without saying a word. That silence told him everything he needed to know about what it had cost her. The morning Clara Beale arrived, The sky was the color of old brass, and the wind was throwing dust against everything it could find. Eli drove the wagon into town to collect her from the stage stop, a covered bench outside the general store where the mail coach paused for 20 minutes twice a week. She was the only passenger who stepped down. He recognized her immediately, not because he'd been told what she looked like, but because she was looking at the town with an expression he understood. Not disappointment. Not shock. More like confirmation of something she'd already prepared herself for. She was tall for a woman, dark-haired, with sharp cheekbones and calm eyes the color of pine in shade. She wore a gray traveling dress and carried a carpet bag in each hand, one clearly heavier than the other. When she saw him standing beside the wagon, she walked straight toward him without hesitation. "Mr. Cutter," she said. It wasn't a question. "Miss Beale." They shook hands. Her grip was firm and brief. "How far?" she asked, glancing toward the horizon. 2 miles. "Roads rough." "Roads always are," she said, and lifted her bags into the wagon bed herself before he could offer to help. He watched her settle onto the bench beside him, straight-backed and composed, and felt something shift in the air between them. Not warmth, not yet, but something more honest than warmth. A kind of mutual acknowledgement. Two people who had both learned to carry things alone. He flicked the reins. The wagon rolled forward. Either of them spoke for the first mile. It was Henry, Eli's 6-year-old, who finally broke what would have been a tense first introduction, because when the wagon pulled into the yard, all 7 children were standing on the porch in a row, and Henry immediately marched down the steps, walked up to Clara, and said in a voice of great seriousness, "Can you make biscuits that don't taste like dirt?" Clara looked at him for a moment with those still, dark eyes. "Better than that," she said. "I can make biscuits that taste like they were made by someone who actually wanted to." Henry blinked. Then he grinned, the first real grin on that porch in 2 years. Thomas, watching from the steps with his arms crossed and his jaw set like his father's, didn't smile at all. He was already watching the road behind the wagon. He'd noticed the dust cloud on the horizon. Too small for a herd. Too steady for wind. Something was coming toward Dust Creek. And it had been following the stage route all morning. The kitchen became Clara's territory within an hour. Not through force or declaration. She simply moved through it with a quiet competence that was impossible to argue with. She found the flour sack and noted it was low. She located the salt, the lard, the cast iron skillet blackened from years of use, and a collection of herbs hanging from the ceiling beam that had dried to near uselessness but were still worth something. She said nothing critical about any of it. She opened both carpet bags on the kitchen table. The first bag held what she'd promised: cooking supplies. Small paper packets of spices. A good knife wrapped in leather cloth. A recipe journal with a cracked spine, full of dense handwriting in 2 different inks, her own and someone else's, older and more careful. A tin of molasses. Dried apple rings tied in cheesecloth. Nothing extraordinary on its own. But together, the way they were organized, the way she'd chosen each item, it spoke of a woman who had cooked for more than survival. Who had once cooked for love. Ruth watched from the doorway. She was trying to look disinterested and failing. The second bag, the heavier one, Clara set behind her on the floor, away from the table. She didn't open it. Not then. Eli noticed. He said nothing. He'd hired a cook, not a confessor. By evening, the kitchen smelled of something that made 3 of the younger children drift toward it involuntarily, like horses toward water. Clara made a beef stew with dried meat from the pantry, stretched thin but seasoned in a way that transformed it. She made biscuits, real ones, golden brown, with a crust that shattered and an inside that steamed. She made a sweetened cornbread that used the last of the molasses and was worth every drop. The family sat at the long table. Eli at one end. Clara standing, serving. Ruth watching every move. Little Samuel ate 3 biscuits. Eli watched his youngest son eat with an appetite he hadn't shown in months, and something in the man's chest did something complicated and private. "These are good," Thomas said finally stiffly. He said it like he was paying a debt he resented. "Thank you," Clara said simply, and poured him more coffee. After supper, while the children were being settled towards sleep, Eli came to stand in the kitchen doorway. Clara was washing the cast iron at the basin. The lamp threw a warm circle of gold across the floor. "You've cooked for a large family before," he said. It wasn't a question. She set the pan down. "I've cooked for a lot of people," she said. "Different situations." "Where?" A pause. Just long enough to mean something. "Kansas, mostly. A few years in Colorado." "You've moved around." "I have." He nodded slowly. He was a man who understood when a conversation had hit its natural border, and when pushing past it would cause more damage than light. "The children like you already," he said. "Except Thomas. Thomas is protecting his family," she said. "That's not a flaw. That's a son who loves his father and hasn't found a way to say it." Eli was quiet for a moment. Then, "There's something you need to tell me, Miss Beale?" Clara turned from the basin and looked at him directly. That steady, dark-eyed look that gave nothing away and yet somehow felt entirely honest. "Not tonight," she said. "But soon." He accepted that. He walked out to the porch and sat and looked at the stars and tried to decide if he'd made a mistake, or the truest decision he'd made in 2 years. The night was still. At midnight, Clara opened the second bag alone in the room she'd been given, a small space off the main hall, formerly a storage room, now cleared and furnished with a cot and a wooden chair. She unpacked the bag in the dark, by feel. Her hands knew every item. At the very bottom, wrapped in canvas and then in wool, was a bundle she placed under the loose floorboard she'd already identified by the way it shifted when she stepped on it. She knew she needed eventually. She'd been hoping, since Missouri, since the ashes of that letter floated into the winter sky, that she'd be wrong about that. But 2 miles back, she'd seen what Thomas had seen. The dust cloud on the horizon. She'd recognized it. She lay on the cot and stared at the ceiling and told herself she had time. A few days, maybe? A week if she was fortunate. Enough time to know if this place, this creaking, dust-blown, beautiful, struggling home, was worth fighting for. She thought of Henry and his biscuit question. She almost smiled. Then she thought of the men following her, and the smile died before it finished forming. She closed her eyes. Outside, the desert made no sound at all. Trouble in Dust Creek rarely announced itself. It arrived the way bad weather did, with a change in the air first, a stillness that the animals noticed before the people did. The dogs stopped barking at ordinary things. The horses shifted in the stable with a nervousness that had no obvious cause. The old men who sat outside the general store playing checkers started glancing toward the eastern road more often than usual. It was Eli who first saw the riders from his fence line, 2 of them, moving slow and deliberate through the haze of a Thursday morning. He watched them from beneath the brim of his hat without moving. They rode like men who weren't lost. Men who knew exactly where they were going and were in no particular hurry because they were certain their destination wasn't going anywhere. They went to the Buckhorn first. That's what men like that always did. Saloons were information exchanges. Ask the right questions, buy the right drinks, and a town would tell you everything it knew. Eli finished his fence work and went home. Clara was in the kitchen with the twins, teaching them how to roll dough. She had flour on her hands and the girls were laughing at something. He stood in the doorway for a moment without saying anything. Then, 2 riders came in this morning. The rolling stopped. Clara's hands went still on the dough. She didn't turn around immediately. When she did, her face was composed. "Describe them," she said. He did. One tall, in a black coat with silver buttons. One shorter, with a red kerchief and a beard that grew mostly on one side of his face from an old scar. Clara set the rolling pin down carefully. She turned to the twins. Alice, May, go find your brother Henry and play outside for a bit. Not past the yard, all right? The girls went. When they were out, Clara dried her hands on her apron and looked at Eli with those calm eyes that he was beginning to understand weren't calm at all. They were controlled. There was a significant difference. How much do you trust the sheriff here? She asked. Jim Larrabee? He's honest enough. Not particularly brave. That's what I thought. She moved toward the hallway. Miss Beale. His voice caught her. Those men, they're looking for you. Yes, she said simply. Do you want to tell me what you did? I want to tell you what someone did to me, she corrected. And what I took back. She paused in the doorway. There's a difference between theft and recovery, Mr. Cutter. It depends entirely on who originally owned the thing. She disappeared into her room. Eli stood in his kitchen for a long moment, surrounded by the smell of biscuits and rolled dough and the warmth of a house that had started, just barely, tentatively, to feel alive again. He thought about the obvious thing, which was that he should go into town, find out who those men were and what they wanted, and figure out whether he'd made a catastrophic error in judgment by letting this woman into his home and near his children. He also thought about the way Samuel had slept through the night for the first time since winter without crying once. He went and knocked on her door. She opened it immediately, like she'd been waiting. What did you take? He asked. She studied him for a moment. Then she stepped aside. The loose floorboard was up. She reached down and brought out the canvas and wool bundle and set it on the cot and unwrapped it with the precise, careful movements of someone who knew exactly what they were handling. Inside were three things: a leather document pouch, a woman's locket on a silver chain, and a roll of paper money held with a cord, more money than Eli would see in 3 years of hard farming. The locket was my mother's, she said. Taken from me in Abilene 4 years ago by a man named Garrett Poole. He runs freight and worse things between here and Santa Fe. The documents in that pouch prove he's been running stolen cattle across 3 territories under forged brands. The money. She paused. The money is what he paid people to look the other way. I took it when I left. It felt fair. Eli looked at the money. At the documents. At the locket. Those 2 men outside, he said. They work for Poole. He'll be along himself, eventually. He doesn't send men to do his talking until they've done his looking first. And if they find you here? They'll find me here, she said. I stopped running in Missouri. I burned the letter Poole sent threatening me and I bought a train ticket instead. I'm done running. Eli was quiet for a long time. The desert wind pressed against the window. Outside, he could hear Alice and May calling to each other across the yard. How long do we have? He said. Days, she said. Maybe less. He looked at her. She looked back at him. Neither of them looked away. All right, he said. Then we'd better get ready. Thomas, leaning against the hallway wall just outside the door where he'd been listening, heard those words and felt something shift in him, something between fear and the particular kind of relief that comes when the waiting finally ends. He pushed off the wall and went to find where his father kept the spare ammunition. Sheriff Jim Larrabee was a man who had chosen comfort over courage so many times in his career that the choice no longer required any deliberation. He was 53 years old, soft in the middle, with a star pinned to his vest that had more symbolic than practical value at this particular point in his tenure. He wasn't a coward in the classic sense. He wouldn't run from a rattlesnake or a burning building. He simply had a very carefully calibrated sense of which fights were worth the cost of fighting. Eli Cutter stood on the other side of Larrabee's desk and laid out the situation with the same economy of words he brought to everything. 2 men in town, working for a freighter named Garrett Poole, who was himself likely en route, who operated stolen livestock routes across 3 territories, and whose evidence was currently under a floorboard 2 miles outside of town. Larrabee listened to all of this with his hands folded on his desk and the expression of a man receiving news he would have preferred not to receive. "You're sure about the documents?" Larrabee said. "I haven't read them." "She has." "I believe her." "You believe a woman you've known for 4 days." "I've known liars for 40 years, Eli said. "She isn't one." Larrabee sighed the sigh of a man who has been cornered by inconvenient truth. "Those 2 riders, Harkin and Slade, I've seen their names on wires before. Low-level muscle. Poole keeps them clean enough to walk into towns without starting trouble before he's ready." "And Poole himself?" "He's got friends in the territorial governor's office." "Not many. But enough to make a small-town sheriff think very carefully about whose business he inserts himself into." Larrabee looked at his hands. "Eli, I'm telling you this because you're a reasonable man. If these people are who your woman says they are, the smart play is to give them what they want and let them ride on." "She's not my woman," Eli said. "And you're describing surrender." "I'm describing survival. My youngest is 3 years old," Eli said. "When men like Poole ride into a situation like this, documents that can put him in a federal prison, witness who can testify, they don't take what they want and ride on peaceful. They remove the problem entirely." The word remove sat in the air between them. Larrabee knew what it meant. He shifted in his chair. "What do you want from me, Eli?" "I want you to do your job." A long silence. The clock on the wall ticked. "I'll look into it," Larrabee said finally. "That's the best I can offer tonight." Eli walked out. On the boardwalk outside, he stood in the afternoon heat and looked down the street toward the Buckhorn. Through the window, he could see the shapes of the 2 men, Harkin and Slade, at the bar. They hadn't caused any trouble. They were being careful. Patient. Patience was its own kind of threat. He walked back toward his wagon. He hadn't gone 10 steps when a hand caught his arm. He turned. It was Bill Marsh, who ran the general store, a big, quiet man with 4 children of his own. Behind him stood Pete Arden from the livery, and Doc Whitmore, who was old but not frail, and 2 of the younger ranchers whose names Eli knew from church. "We heard," Marsh said simply. "Word travels in a town this size." Eli looked at them. "Larrabee won't move," Marsh continued. "We all know that. But some of us think—" He stopped, restructured. "We've got children too, Eli. If Poole's the kind of man you're saying, and he comes in here with a crew, it isn't just your problem. It's 61 people's problem." Eli felt something in his chest that he hadn't felt in a long time. "Not quite hope. More foundational than that." "What are you proposing?" he said. "Nothing dramatic," Marsh said. "But if it comes to it, we're not going to stand on our porches and watch." Eli nodded slowly. He looked at each of them in turn. "Go home tonight," he said. "Be ready tomorrow." He drove back to the homestead in the long blue dusk. Clara was on the porch when he arrived, the younger children inside. She'd been watching the road. "Larrabee?" she said. "Won't help. Not openly. And the town?" He told her about Marsh and the others. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "I didn't come here to bring this to your door," she said. "I want you to know that." "I know," he said. "I thought I'd have more time. I thought—" She stopped. The control in her face slipped for just a second, just enough for him to see what lived underneath it. Fear, yes. But also something older and harder than fear. Grief. The particular grief of a person who has had too many things taken from them, and is tired all the way down to the bone. "We make our stand here," Eli said. "This is my land. My family. Nobody rides onto my land and removes anything." He said the word back to her, removes, and she understood he'd been thinking about what it really meant this whole time. She nodded once, and her eyes went back to being still. But inside, deep inside, in the place she didn't show anyone, Something that had been clenched for 4 years loosened one small, careful degree. Inside the house, Henry was asking Thomas to read him a story, and Thomas, the boy who hadn't smiled in 2 years, was actually doing it. The night came down around the homestead like a held breath. Garrett Poole arrived on a Friday morning with 4 men and no pretense. He was not what people expected when they imagined a man who ran stolen cattle and paid for silence across 3 territories. He wasn't physically imposing. He was perhaps 55, compact and dry as a piece of cured leather, with neat gray hair and clean clothes and the manner of a businessman stopping in for a routine transaction. He wore a good hat. His boots were expensive. He smiled often and easily, and the smile never reached his eyes, which were the pale, flat blue of a winter sky with nothing behind it. He rode into Dust Creek at 8 in the morning and went directly to Larrabee's office. Clara watched from the window of the general store, where Marsh had let her wait. She'd seen Poole exactly once before, on the night in Abilene when she'd taken back what was hers. She'd been in shadow. She wasn't sure he'd seen her face clearly. She was sure now that it didn't matter. He'd found her anyway. Poole was in Larrabee's office for 20 minutes. When he came out, he was still smiling. He paused on the boardwalk and looked down the street with the easy patience of a man who owns the clock. Then he and his men rode slowly toward the Buckhorn. Larrabee came out of his office 2 minutes later. He didn't look toward the general store. He walked to the far end of the boardwalk, turned his back to the street, and stood looking at nothing. That was his answer. Clara walked back to where Eli had the wagon waiting behind the feed lot. Thomas was with him. The boy was 17 in his bearing today. He'd been 17 in his bearing for 2 years, but today it meant something different. He went to Larrabee first, she said. Buying himself a clear path, Eli said. He'll come to the homestead. Probably midday, wants witnesses gone, wants heat high and judgment slow. She paused. He'll bring all 4 men. That makes 5. Thomas said. Yes, she said. Thomas looked at his father. Eli looked at his son. The communication between them was the wordless kind that passes between people who have lived hard days together and know each other all the way through. Marsh and the others? Clara said. Ready, Eli said. But I don't want them in the middle of this if I can help it. This is Poole's business with you. I want to keep the town out of the shooting if there's a way. There might be, Clara said. She told them what she had in mind. Thomas started shaking his head before she finished. That puts you directly in front of him, he said. Alone. I know. That's. He searched for the word. That's not a plan, that's a sacrifice. It's a gamble, she corrected. There's a difference. A sacrifice means you've already decided to lose. A gamble means you've decided the odds are worth it. Thomas stared at her. He was trying to maintain the wall he built against her, the careful, necessary wall of a boy who couldn't afford to need someone else who might leave. But the wall had been taking damage all week. Her biscuits. The way she'd fixed Henry's shoe without being asked. The way she'd sat with Ruth one evening and talked quietly about something he hadn't been able to hear, but which had made Ruth cry and then laugh within 5 minutes. The wall took more damage now. What are the odds? He said. Better with the documents in hand, she said. A man like Poole is afraid of 2 things, prison and public humiliation. If I'm standing in his path with the proof of what he's done, he has to make a calculation. Shoot me in front of witnesses and create the very scandal he's trying to prevent. Or negotiate. And if he's past calculating? Eli said. Then we do it the other way, she said quietly. But I'd like to try talking first. Eli considered her for a long moment. The children are at Marsh's wife's house, he said. All 7 of them. She exhaled. She hadn't known he'd done that yet. She hadn't asked him to. All right, she said. Then let's go home and wait. They drove back in silence. The road was hot, and the sky above the red ridges was enormous and cloudless. Eli watched the horizon. Clara watched her hands. Thomas watched both of them with the eyes of someone cataloging every detail of a moment he understands he will carry for the rest of his life. At the homestead they had 2 hours. Eli checked his rifle. Clara retrieved her bundle from under the floorboard and placed the document pouch in her coat. The locket went around her neck. The money stayed where it was. She came out onto the porch and stood in the sun and thought about Missouri. About burned letters. About the particular kind of decision that becomes inevitable not because of courage, but because you've finally run out of directions to run in. She thought about Henry's question on the first day. Can you make biscuits that don't taste like dirt? She thought, I can make something better than that. I'm trying. The dust appeared on the eastern road at 10 minutes past noon. 5 riders. Garrett Poole rode at the front, still smiling, still impeccably dressed, as though he were arriving for a business lunch and not to erase a woman and everything she knew. Clara stepped off the porch and walked to the middle of the yard and stood there in the open, document pouch in hand, waiting. Poole reined his horse 30 feet from where Clara stood. He took his time looking at her. The smile stayed in place. Behind him, his 4 men fanned slowly to either side, a practice movement, casual, like men settling into comfortable seats. Harkin in the black coat on the left. Slade with his scarred beard on the right. 2 others Eli didn't recognize spreading wide toward the fence line. Eli stood on the porch with his rifle. Thomas was inside at the window. The angles were calculated. Nothing about the next few minutes was accidental. Miss Beale, Poole said pleasantly, as though they were meeting at a social. I have to tell you, I admire the nerve. I genuinely do. Most people, when they take something from me, they run as long as their legs hold out. You took a train in the opposite direction. He tilted his head. That's either very brave or very stupid. Or very deliberate, Clara said. He raised an eyebrow. Meaning? Meaning I didn't run to Dust Creek by accident, she said. I came here because the nearest federal marshal's office with a telegraph line is in Harmon's Bluff, 18 miles north. And because I'd already sent a letter to the United States Marshal's office in Santa Fe describing your operation, your routes, and the names of every territorial official you've purchased. That letter went out 3 weeks ago. She paused. The documents in this pouch are copies. The originals are in Santa Fe. The smile didn't disappear. But it changed. Subtle shift, like a door that looks closed but is open a crack. That's a story, he said. It's a fact, she said. Shoot me here, in front of witnesses, and you add murder to the federal charges already waiting for you. Right away, and you're still done. The only question is whether you go quietly or noisily. Poole was quiet. The wind moved through the yard. Somewhere behind the fence, a horse stamped. You know what I think, he said softly, and the pleasantness had gone now, scraped away to show what was underneath, which was old and cold and without any kindness at all. I think you're bluffing. I think you're a woman standing in a dirt yard trying to survive the next 10 minutes, and you're saying whatever you have to say to do it. Maybe, she said. But can you afford to be wrong? His right hand dropped toward his coat. It happened very fast. The shot came from the left side of the road, not from the porch, not from the window. From behind the stone water trough along the fence line, where Bill Marsh had been lying flat since an hour before the riders arrived. The shot took Harkin's hat clean off his head and buried itself in the fence post directly behind him. Marsh stood up from behind the trough. Pete Arden rose from behind the far fence corner. 3 more men appeared from behind the stable wall. Doc Whitmore, old, white-haired, steady-handed, was visible in the open doorway of the barn with a shotgun resting across his forearm. Not threatening. Not aggressive. Simply there. Present. Immovable. Larrabee had said the town wouldn't move. Larrabee had been wrong about this town. Poole looked at the men surrounding him with an expression that moved through several stages very quickly: calculation, fury. The specific cold fear of a man who has just understood that he miscounted, and finally, the settling of a man who knows when a play is finished. The hand came up empty from his coat. "You planned this," he said. Not to Clara. To the yard. To all of them. "She planned it," Eli said from the porch. "We just showed up." Slade moved, barely, just a shifting of weight, and Eli's rifle came up without hurry and settled. "I wouldn't," Eli said. The two words were so quiet and so final that Slade seemed to reconsider his entire existence. Poole looked at Clara for a long moment. The document pouch in her hand. The locket at her throat. His eyes caught on it, recognized it, and something moved across his face that might have been shame if he'd been a different kind of man. "The letter to Santa Fe," he said. "Sent 3 weeks ago," she said. "You can verify it if you need to." He knew, she could see, that she was telling the truth. Not because she was above bluffing, she'd proven she wasn't. But because a bluff this carefully constructed, with this many moving parts, with real witnesses and real documents, had a different weight to it than a desperate lie. He was a man who'd made his living reading people, and he was reading her now, and he didn't like what the pages said. "Then it's done," he said flatly. "It's done," she agreed. He turned his horse. His men followed, Slade last. With a look at Eli that carried promises, Eli returned without expression. The 5 riders moved back down the eastern road. The men from town watched until the dust settled. Nobody moved until the horizon was empty. Then, slowly, the yard breathed again. Marsh walked over from the water trough, brushing dust from his chest. He looked at Clara with an expression of profound pragmatic respect. "You were right about the timing," he said. "People like Poole make their moves at high heat," she said. "It slows the thinking." She paused. "Thank you. All of you." Eli came down from the porch. He stood in front of her. He was a man of very few words and even fewer demonstrations, but he looked at her, really looked, the way he hadn't fully allowed himself to yet, and he said, "Are you all right?" "Yes," she said. "Are you sure?" She put her hand to the locket at her throat, closed her fingers around it for a moment. "I will be," she said. It was the most honest thing he'd heard anyone say in 2 years. That evening, when all 7 children came back from Marsh's house, Henry ran straight to Clara and grabbed her hand without preamble and dragged her toward the kitchen. "We want the biscuits again," he announced. Ruth was in the kitchen doorway. She watched Clara come in with Henry attached to her hand, and she looked at her, the girl who'd been cooking and cleaning and holding this household together with both hands for 2 years. The girl who'd been a mother when she was 12 years old, the girl who'd stood in a doorway and watched Clara roll dough with her sisters and felt something very complicated and very necessary. "I'll help," Ruth said quietly. Clara looked at her. "I was hoping you would," she said. "I'd like to learn your mother's way of doing things. If you're willing to teach me." Ruth was quiet for a moment. Then she tied on her apron. And that was that. The locket, Clara's mother's locket, gold and worn smooth, with a small painted portrait inside, hung at her throat while she cooked. It swung forward when she bent over the mixing bowl. Henry watched it with interest. "What's that?" he asked. "Something that belongs to me," she said. "Something I went a long way to get back." He considered this. "Like how Papa went to get the horse that ran off last spring." "Something like that," she said. "Exactly like that." After supper, after all the children were in bed, even Thomas, who had not gone to sleep but had stopped pretending he was still awake at his window, Eli sat on the porch in the dark. Clara came and sat in the other chair. The desert was enormous and quiet around them, and the stars were excessive in their brightness. They sat for a while without speaking. "Poole won't stop," Eli said finally. "Not permanently." "No," she agreed. But he'll slow down. And the marshal in Santa Fe will find the letters. It'll be enough. You hope. I believe. She corrected. There's a difference. He was quiet again. The wind moved through the yard. Somewhere a coyote spoke to the dark, and the dark said nothing back. My wife used to say. He started, and stopped. He almost never talked about Mary. The children knew not to ask directly. But something about the night, about the week, about the particular exhaustion and aliveness of a day that could have ended very differently, something loosened the usual locks. She used to say that a home isn't the building. It's the people who choose to stay in it. Even when staying is the harder thing. Clara was quiet. She sounds like she was right, she said finally. She usually was, he said. They sat until the stars began their slow wheel across the sky. She could have left. The threat wasn't over, not entirely. Poole's men would drift back eventually. Federal marshals moved slowly. Justice in the territories was a river with a long, winding path. She had money under the floorboard. She had a train ticket she hadn't used. She could have left. She thought about Missouri. About burned letters. About the particular moment on the platform when she'd read 11 words in a newspaper clipping and felt, for the first time in years. Not hope exactly, but the shape of something hope could grow in. Soil, not the flower. But still. She thought about Ruth tying on her apron. Henry and his biscuit question. Samuel sleeping through the night. Thomas, who was pretending to sleep but wasn't, because he was lying in his room running through every moment of the day and finding, against his will, that the tally came out in her favor. She thought about what she'd brought, the cooking supplies, yes, and the documents that exposed the criminal, and the locket that was her mother's, and the money she'd taken back because it was fair. But underneath all of that, what she'd really carried in those bags, all the way from Missouri on a train she'd almost not boarded. Something she hadn't even named yet. Something that didn't have a word in the language of the West, which was a language built for distance and hardness and survival. But it was something like permanence. Something like the willingness to plant your feet in hard ground and say, here. Not another inch. Here. She'd brought that. In the end, it was the most valuable thing any person can carry into someone else's broken world. Eli turned and looked at her in the dark. Miss Beale, he said. Clara, she said. A pause. Long enough to mean something. Clara, he said. The desert held its breath. And inside the house, in a room off the main hall, under a loose floorboard that she hadn't yet bothered to put back exactly right, the money and the empty canvas and wool wrapping lay in the dark. No longer needed, no longer the most important thing she owned. 7 children slept. A man sat on a porch and called her by her name. And a woman who had stopped running sat beside him and listened to the night and felt, for the first time in 4 years, the strange and terrifying and irreplaceable sensation of having arrived. Garrett Poole was arrested 11 weeks later, in Santa Fe, by 2 federal marshals who had been building their case since March. The charges included theft of livestock across territorial lines, bribery of public officials, and conspiracy. He spent the rest of his life in a federal penitentiary outside of Denver. He died there in the winter of 1889, neat and cold to the last. Harkin and Slade disappeared into the territories and were never specifically heard from again, which is the fate of men who exist only in service to someone else's ambition. When the center falls, the edges scatter. Sheriff Larrabee resigned his post the following spring. He told people it was his health. The people of Dust Creek nodded politely, and said nothing to contradict him, which was its own kind of mercy. Bill Marsh's general store burned down 2 years later in an accidental fire, and the entire town showed up the next morning to help rebuild it. They had that kind of muscle memory by then. Clara Beale and Eli Cutter were married in October, in the crooked little church on the edge of Dust Creek, on one of the 3 days a year that Reverend Calloway came down from Harmon's Bluff. All 7 children attended. Henry wore his best shirt, which was also his only shirt. Ruth stood beside Clara and held the locket while Clara could not during the ceremony, held it carefully, with both hands, the way you hold something that matters. Thomas shook Eli's hand afterward. Then, slowly, he turned to Clara. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "Can you teach me the biscuit recipe?" Clara looked at him for a long moment, this boy man who had watched the road with suspicious eyes since the first day, who had protected his family with his stillness and his watchfulness and his careful, guarded heart. "I'll do better than that," she said. "I'll teach you everything I know." He nodded once, the way his father nodded, precise and final and full of things he didn't have words for yet. They walked back to the house together. All 9 of them. Across the hard ground of a homestead that the desert had tried to swallow, and the seasons had tried to break and grief had tried to hollow out, and almost succeeded. Almost. The kitchen smelled like biscuits and coffee and the dried herbs Clara had replaced, and the wood smoke of the good cast iron skillet. Little Samuel sat on the kitchen floor with a wooden horse, narrating its adventures to himself in a small, serious voice. Clara hung her coat, rolled up her sleeves. "All right," she said to the room, to the family, to the ordinary extraordinary chaos of 8 people in a small house trying to be something whole together. "Who's hungry?" 7 voices answered. The West was hard. It took things, land, water, years, people. It was not romantic in the way that those who had never lived it imagined. It was dust and heat and drought, and the terrible arithmetic of seasons that didn't care about your plans. It tested everything you built and everyone you loved, and it did not apologize for any of it. But sometimes, rarely, and only for those willing to stop running long enough to plant something, it gave back. Not what was taken. You never got exactly that back. Something better. Something you didn't know to ask for until it was already standing in front of you with flour on its hands and a question in its eyes and a carpetbag full of things that turned out to be worth more than anyone had thought to advertise. Widower. 7 children. Needs a wife who can cook. Dust Creek. She'd brought that. And she'd brought the rest. And in a world that measured worth in land and cattle and gold, Clara Beale had understood something that Eli Cutter, standing on his porch in the dark that first night, had just barely begun to remember, that the most valuable thing one person can offer another is simply this, to stay. In the end, it wasn't what she carried in that bag that saved them. It was that she chose to unpack it.